Whoever says making continuous bias binding is boring has not seen the super easy technique I'll show you today. As a matter of fact, I'll show you two different techniques. The first is the most conventional and involves sewing the individual bias strips together separately after they are cut. This technique is a little more time consuming, but great if you only need to sew 2 to 3 bias strips together. The second one makes a much longer continuous bias binding strip in about half the time, and you'll get a perfectly stitched continuous binding strip by applying a single straight stitch. Stick around after the bias strips are stitched together for a look at how to iron continuous fabric strips into a double fold bias binding. Bias binding is one of the most widely used elements in dressmaking. It provides a high-quality way to enclose fabric raw edges while sometimes also becoming part of the garment design. Bias binding is constructed of bias-cut fabric strips that are folded either beforehand or in the sewing process to enclose and finish garment edges. The fabric strips have to be cut on the bias so that when sewn along curved fabric edges, they provide all the necessary stretch and flexibility. The extra stretch provides smooth, tension-free edges. Bias binding can be made at home, cut from the fabric and width of your choice, or store-bought in a pre-folded style. While pre-packaged binding is easy to work with and sew, it is limited by fabric and color availability. Pre-packaged binding is conventionally constructed of a structured, plain cotton fabric, which is often not suitable to use in combination with light, fine fabrics like silks and sheers. So how do you make continuous bias binding at home? Fold the crosswise edge over such that it is aligned parallel to the selvage edge. The diagonal fold will align with the true fabric bias. Iron the diagonal folded edge to crease the bias line. This crease line will serve as the initial starting point for measuring and marking the bias strips. Open the fabric layer and laying it flat on the table with the wrong side up, measure and draw parallel lines at 1 inch apart. Use a clear plastic ruler and tailor's chalk or fabric pencil for this marking portion. Draw as many strips as you need for the project at hand. They will be sewn together to create a continuous binding strips in the steps to follow. Once all the strips have been drawn perfectly on the bias, you can connect the strips together using the following techniques. The first method entails aligning and stitching the binding strip prior to cutting. Bring the two lengthwise fabric edges together such that the fabric face sides are touching. The second bias strip on one fabric edge should align to the first bias strip on the other as shown. When all bias ends are fully matched in this order, there should be one open bias strip end on each side. Pin the matching bias strip ends together horizontally. Be sure to keep them perfectly aligned. You may need to hand baste for extra stability. Stitch the two fabric edges together at 1/4 inch seam allowance. Use a shorter stitch for added durability. After stitching, remove any hand basting stitches. Iron the seam allowance open. Next, starting at one open end of the bias strip, begin cutting down the marked lines following the tubular orientation of the fabric. In this process, you will cut through the seam that connects the bias strips together. Cut until you arrive at the other open end of the strip. The finished cut will be a continuous bias strip with all the individual pieces stitched together on the lengthwise grain. Reinforce each bias strip seam with extra stitching as needed. The second method entails aligning and stitching the binding strips individually. Mark the individual bias strip lines. Include the lengthwise intersecting lines positioned at 1/4 of an inch away from the fabric edge. Carefully cut each individual strip. Align the end of one strip to the end of another such that the fabric right sides are touching and there are little triangle extensions protruding on each side. The lengthwise line located at 1/4 of an inch distance from the edge will mark your seam line. Pin the binding edges together horizontally in this position. Stitch the bias strips together following the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Backstitch at both beginning and end of the stitch. Doing so will provide more durability and comfort when attaching the binding to the garment later on. After machine stitching, iron the seam allowance edges open. When the seam allowance is pressed open, a triangle extension protrudes from both top and bottom of the seam. Trim each extension in line with the bias binding edge. Repeat the process described to attach the rest of the bias strips. Once the individual bias fabric strips are connected into a single bias binding piece, there are several techniques you can use to attach it to the garment. Depending on the end application, bias binding can be stitched as is without the need for pre-folding, or may be pre-folded in various styles depending on the type of finish it is used for. For example, a bias binding used to finish a hemline has just the top and bottom lengthwise edges folded in at about 1/4 of an inch. Bias binding that clean finishes seam allowance, neckline, and armhole edges are pre-folded in a double fold style. To pre-fold binding in a double fold style by hand, fold the binding lengthwise just slightly off-center. The fabric wrong sides should be touching. Iron as you fold at the highest setting appropriate for the fabric. Pressing as you fold will crease and maintain the fold. Next, open the bias binding and fold each lengthwise edge in such that they align to the center fold line. It is easiest to fold one edge at a time. Keeping the two lengthwise edges folded in, fold the binding down the initial center line and press again to crease. It may be helpful to use a light spray starch in the ironing process since some fabrics tend to unfold easily even after being ironed at a high heat setting. To speed up the folding and ironing process, you can use a binding ironing tool like the one pictured. You can purchase them in a variety of widths depending on your desired binding width. This heat-resistant metal tool feeds the binding strip through two channels that fold each one of its lengthwise edges as it comes out on the other end. Start by cutting one end of the bias strip into a pointed triangular shape as shown. Feed that triangular edge through the folding guides and pull on the other side to extract the folded end. Iron the folded binding as it feeds through the bias tape maker.
Don't be afraid of the dark, be careful with stars. Not every light is gonna guide you, baby. Don't let them rain on your spark. Keep it close to your heart. All of the pressure's gonna drive you crazy. Close your eyes to the madness. In the morning it's all gonna vanish. Don't